She was 32 weeks pregnant. The nursery was painted, the crib was assembled, the tiny onesies were folded in the drawer, and her husband was sitting in the driveway, not coming inside, just sitting there, calling her on the phone from 15 feet away. She walked out to the car. She knocked on the window. She got in. And in 60 seconds, everything she believed about her life turned out to be a performance she hadn't known she was watching. He had been gone for 8 months. Not physically, emotionally, legally. He had a whole other life, an apartment already packed and waiting, and a set of documents with her signature on them. Documents she had never signed. He had forged her name. He had built a fiction and handed it to another woman as though it were fact. And he had looked at his pregnant wife every single morning and said, "Have a good day." But here is what he didn't calculate. She used to be a lawyer, and the moment she sat down on that kitchen floor, she didn't cry. She opened her phone, and she started building a case. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes devastation for weakness, when he comes back expecting forgiveness and finds her attorney waiting instead. Stay with this story, because the ending is not what anyone saw coming. Not him, not his family, not even her. This story is about more than betrayal. It is about the moment a woman stops performing the life someone else wrote for her and starts living the one she was always capable of. If you have ever been told not to trust what you clearly saw, this story is for you. If this moved you, like, share, and leave a comment below. Tell us, what was the moment you finally trusted yourself? Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Every week, we bring you real emotional journeys about strength, starting over, and the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage until it's already won.
The call came on a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, not an anniversary, not a birthday, just an ordinary one. The kind that didn't announce itself. The kind that arrived like all the others. Quiet, unremarkable, already halfway gone before you noticed it had started. Clara had been standing at the kitchen counter when her phone buzzed. She'd folded the laundry twice that morning. Her back hurt too much to lie down. She'd eaten cereal, standing over the sink because cooking felt like climbing a mountain. Her feet looked like bread dough. She was 32 weeks pregnant and completely, entirely unsuspecting. Dean's name lit up the screen. She smiled. She actually smiled. "Hey," she said. "I was going to call you. I found that crib we talked about. The one with the convertible frame that grows with her. Clara." His voice was flat. "I need to talk to you." She stopped, put one hand on the counter. "Tonight?" she asked. "Now. I'm in the driveway." She walked to the front window. His black car sat idling at the curb. He hadn't come inside. He was calling her from 15 feet away. He had driven home and parked in the driveway and called her on the phone instead of walking through the door. That was the first crack. Small, hairline thin. She went out anyway. The late afternoon air was cold. October. The kind of October that smells like dead leaves and the memory of something warm. She walked to the passenger side in her maternity leggings and the oversized gray sweater she'd been living in for 3 weeks. She knocked on the window. He lowered it. "Get in," he said. She got in. He looked straight ahead. His jaw was set. She knew that jaw. She'd watched it across conference tables when a deal was going badly. She'd watched it during arguments about small things. Whose turn to call the plumber, whether they were spending too much on the renovation. She'd always thought that jaw meant strength, resolve, the face of a man who knew what he wanted and how to get it. She had never seen it directed at her. Not like this. "Dean, what is—" "I've been seeing someone," he said, "for about 8 months. The air left her body. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way a tire goes flat in cold weather. A slow, invisible deflation. The kind you don't notice until you're already on the ground. 8 months. She was 32 weeks pregnant. The math arrived without invitation. 8 months, 32 weeks. The overlap was exact. He had been with someone else since before she'd known she was pregnant. He had been with someone else when she'd taken the test. When she'd called him from the bathroom, shaking, laughing, crying all at once, when he'd held her and said he was so happy, so ready, so sure they were going to be great at this. All of it. All of it. You were... Her voice cracked. She steadied it. You were already with her when we... Yes. One word. Clean and final as a surgical cut. She looked down at her stomach. Her hand went there, automatically, the way it always did now, protective, involuntary, like her body knew something her mind was still trying to catch up to. Who? She asked. He named her. Simone Brace. He said it quietly, almost gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it hard. Clara knew the name. She had seen it once, a comment on one of Dean's Instagram posts. A small thing, a nothing thing. She had looked at the profile out of a reflex she'd immediately been ashamed of. A beautiful woman, dark hair, photographed in Milan, in Malibu, in places that looked like magazine pages. She had felt a small twist of something, then she had told herself she was being paranoid. She had been so certain she was being paranoid. She pressed her palm flat against her belly. The baby moved, a slow roll, heel to ribs. Don't you feel that? She wanted to scream. Don't you feel her? She didn't scream. She sat very still. Where will you go? She asked. He blinked, like he had expected something different. Tears, yelling, begging. I have an apartment, he said. I've had it for a while. Another stone, another ripple spreading out across still water. How long? She asked. 3 months. 3 months. He had been mentally leaving for 3 months. He had been paying rent on another life while she was registering for baby furniture, while she was choosing paint colors for the nursery, while she was lying next to him in bed, growing their daughter, believing she was safe. She opened the car door. She got out. She walked back into the house. She sat down on the kitchen floor, not because her legs gave out, consciously. She needed to be low, needed the cold tile under her palms, needed something solid and unyielding and real. She sat there for a long time. The laundry was still on the counter, folded in neat stacks. His shirts on the left, hers on the right. She stared at his shirts, 5 of them, cotton, pressed, smelling like the fabric softener she had bought and she had washed and she had folded. She picked one up. She put it in the trash. Then she sat back down on the floor. She checked her phone 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock, lock. No texts, no apology following her inside, no second thoughts chasing her through the front door. Just the quiet of a house that had already been half emptied without her knowing. She pressed her forehead against the cabinet door. The wood was smooth and cool against her skin. She did not cry, not yet. That surprised her. She had always assumed that if something like this ever happened, and she had never seriously believed it would, she would fall apart, dissolve completely, become nothing. Instead, she felt hollow, carved out, like a gourd someone had cleaned but not yet made into anything new. She thought, I am 32 weeks pregnant. She thought, I have a law degree I haven't used in 4 years. She thought, I need a lawyer. Not a couples counselor, not a friend, not her mother, not yet. A lawyer. Something shifted in her chest. Not hope exactly, something older than hope. The distant, bone-deep memory of who she used to be before she became someone's wife. She looked at the trash can. His shirts sat on top. She added 2 more. Then she picked up her phone, typed into the search bar, Best Divorce Attorney, Women's Rights, Family Law, Chicago. She pressed search. She checked her phone again. Lock? Unlock. Actually, no. She kept it unlocked. She started reading. The sky outside went dark while she read. She didn't turn on the kitchen light. She sat in the growing dark with the phone light blue and cold on her face, reading about marital property law and spousal contribution and asset disclosure requirements. She read the way she used to read before trial preparation, hungrily, with focus, with the particular attention of a person who understands that information is the only thing that cannot be taken from you. At some point, she got up and made tea. She stood at the stove, waiting for the kettle, and thought, he was in this kitchen this morning. He made coffee. He kissed me on the top of the head. He said, have a good day. He said, have a good day, and then he drove to work knowing that tonight he was going to come home and sit in the driveway and say those words. She thought about the jaw. She thought, I have been reading that jaw wrong for 4 years. The kettle whistled. She made the tea. She carried it back to the counter and kept reading. By 10 o'clock, she had a list of 3 attorneys. She had ranked them. She had reviewed their case histories. She had noted their billing rates and their win records and the specific language they used on their websites to describe what they did for women in situations like hers. She circled the name at the top of her list. Margaret Folsom. Folsom Family Law. She would call in the morning. She turned off the kitchen light finally, walked to the bedroom, stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the bed, their bed. His side still had the slight indentation of him. She walked to his side, picked up his pillow, put it in the hallway. Then she got into bed, on her own side, and stared at the ceiling. The baby moved, a slow, thoughtful movement, like a question. I know, Clara thought, I know. She pressed her hand to her side. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she stayed still. And sometimes that's enough. She thought about the name Margaret Folsom until it felt like an anchor, something to hold onto, something to call in the morning. Outside, October continued being October, cold and dark, and absolutely indifferent to her situation. Somewhere, Dean was in an apartment that had been ready for 3 months. Clara lay in the dark and thought, he planned this. He planned this carefully and completely, and I did not see it coming. She thought, I am going to be terrifying when I figure out why. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the bed, their bed, which she refused to leave on principle, and stared at the ceiling and did what every rational, intelligent woman does at 3 in the morning when her life has just been demolished. She Googled Simone Brace. The phone light was blue and cold in the dark. She told herself she wasn't going to. She told herself twice. Then she typed the name anyway. Instagram first. 12,000 followers. The profile loaded slowly on the dim screen. Photos from rooftop restaurants. Fashion Week. A campaign for a regional jewelry brand. Silver chains, white backgrounds, the model's collarbone lit like something precious. Clara had bought a necklace from that company last Christmas. She had given it to herself as a gift after Dean said he didn't know what to get her. She had wrapped it herself and put her name on the tag and laughed about it with Trish over the phone. She had bought a necklace from a company that employed the woman sleeping with her husband. The universe had a vicious sense of humor. She scrolled. She hated herself for scrolling. She scrolled more. Simone was 26. Beautiful the way people are beautiful on film. Luminous and slightly unreal. Like someone had turned up the contrast on a regular person and called it glamour. In every picture, she smiled the smile of someone with no complications. Someone who had never woken up at 3 in the morning, Googling the woman she used to be. Clara put the phone face down. She picked it up again. She found a comment thread under one of Simone's posts. 6 months old. A follower had asked about a location. Simone had replied, And someone else, a different account, now deleted, had replied to Simone, "Does he know you're posting this publicly? Be careful." Clara stared at that line. Does he know you're posting this publicly? Not a compliment, not a playful tease, a warning, direct and specific. Who had been warning her? Clara screenshotted it, filed it in the back of her mind. Not urgent, but worth keeping. The way you keep a piece of testimony that doesn't fit the current theory, but might fit a later one. She set the phone down. She put her hand on her belly. The baby was still. Your father, Clara said quietly, to the dark, is a more complicated problem than I initially understood. She didn't meet Simone until 11 days later. She had not expected a phone call. She had expected silence or lawyers or some combination of the two. She had braced for smugness the way you brace for a slap. Jaw set, spine straight, every piece of dignity she had assembled around her like armor. It wasn't like that. Simone called her on the Wednesday morning. Clara answered because she answered everything now. She answered every number she didn't recognize. She had learned in 11 days to pay attention. She answered the way a woman who is paying attention answers things. Clara Whitfield? The voice was younger than she'd expected. Careful, like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. Yes, Clara said. A pause, long enough to hear breath, long enough to know this call had been rehearsed, and the caller was still scared. This is Simone. Clara sat down. Slowly, she was in the kitchen. She pulled out a chair and sat down the way you sit down when you need to do something difficult, and you want to do it with your feet on the ground. He told you my number? She asked. I found it myself, Simone said. I needed to talk to you, not for his sake, for mine. There was something in her voice Clara hadn't expected, something young and frightened, and not at all like the woman in the photographs. Not the woman with the luminous smile and the easy posture and the life that looked like a magazine page. This was a different person, a scared one. He told me you were separated, Simone said. For 2 years. He told me you were in the process of divorce. He showed me papers. Clara went very still. What papers? She asked carefully. A separation agreement, Simone said, dated 14 months ago, with your signature on it. Clara's blood went cold. She felt it, physically, a drop in temperature that started in her chest and moved outward. Simone, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady. I have never signed any separation papers. I did not know he was unhappy. I was pregnant with our first child. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. When Simone spoke again, her voice had changed. Something had left it, something she'd been carrying. He told me, she said slowly, that the pregnancy was a mistake, that you had both agreed it was a mistake, and that you were keeping the baby, but ending the marriage. He said you had agreed on everything. He said it was amicable. Clara looked at the yellow wall of the kitchen, the wall she'd been staring at for 11 days while her world reorganized itself around her. Amicable. He had told this woman that the destruction of Clara's life was amicable. The signature on those papers, Clara said. Can you send them to me? They're fake, Simone said. Flat. Certain. I know they're fake now. I looked up the notary number. It doesn't exist. He had forged legal documents. He had created a false separation agreement with a fabricated notary stamp and used it to convince his girlfriend that his marriage was already over. He had not just cheated, he had not just left. He had built an entire legal fiction and handed it to another person as though it were true, the jaw. Always calculating. Clara understood it now. Are you still with him? Clara asked. A silence. Then, no. He moved in after he left you, and then things became very clear very quickly. A breath. The real version of him is different from the version I knew. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Clara looked at her belly. 8 months ago, Simone had believed she was dating a separated man. At the same moment, Clara had believed she was in a solid marriage. 2 women, 2 complete fictions. One man carefully maintaining both. She thought about the deleted account on Instagram. Be careful. Someone had known. Someone close enough to know and distant enough not to intervene. Don't apologize to me, Clara said. Save your apology for the right person. Who's that? Your attorney, Clara said. Because if he showed you forged legal documents, that is a crime. You are going to want to document everything, every text, every conversation where he described your relationship, every time those documents were referenced. A short, startled pause. Then, you're a lawyer? I used to be, Clara said. I'm about to be again. She hung up. She sat for a moment in the kitchen chair. The world had rearranged itself. Dean was not a man who had fallen out of love and made a foolish choice in a weak moment. Dean was a man who had been running a theater, a careful, elaborate, multi-year production with different scripts for different audiences and a very specific plan for how the curtain was going to fall. Clara had been the audience who believed it was real life. The baby kicked. Strong. Purposeful. I know, Clara said. I'm on it. She pulled up her contacts, found the name she had circled 11 days ago at the kitchen counter in the dark. Margaret Folsom. She pressed call. Meg picked up on the second ring. Her voice was exactly what Clara had expected from the website. Direct. Warm underneath. The voice of a woman who had heard everything and been surprised by none of it. Clara Whitfield, Clara said. I called last week. I have new information. Significant new information. Tell me, Meg said. He used forged documents, a fake separation agreement with a fabricated notary. He showed them to the woman he was seeing. She has them. A pause on the other end. Not surprised. Interested. Ms. Whitfield, Meg said, your case just got very interesting. I was hoping you'd say that, Clara said. Can you come in tomorrow? Yes, Clara said. I'll be there. She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she stood up, slowly, because she was 32 weeks pregnant, and everything took effort now. She walked to the refrigerator. She found the leftover soup Trish had brought 2 days ago. She heated it on the stove. She stood at the stove and stirred the soup and thought about the word forged. Forged. A legal term with a specific weight. A term that moved a case from civil court into other territories. A term that meant this was not a man who simply failed at marriage. This was a man who committed deliberate acts with deliberate intent. The soup steamed. She poured it into a bowl. She sat at the table and ate every bite. She was eating for 2. She needed to remember that. She needed to be well and fed and strong. She had work to do. Beverly Whitfield always wore lavender. Not sometimes, not seasonally, always. Like a personal brand, like a standing appointment with a particular identity. Lavender sweater sets, lavender scarves, a lavender brooch, for formal occasions that Clara had secretly named the Authority Badge. The smell of lavender had become, over 4 years of marriage, a conditioned response. Clara could not pass a soap aisle in a department store without her shoulders tightening. Beverly called on a Thursday, 11 days after Dean left. Clara almost didn't answer. Her thumb hovered over the red button. Then she thought about what Meg had told her the day before. Document everything. Answer everything. Let them talk. Talking people make evidence. She answered. Clara, darling. Beverly's voice, velvet over gravel. 64 years of practiced softness over absolute iron. I want you to know how terribly sorry I am. This must be so hard for you. Clara noted, with clinical precision, that Beverly had not said Dean was wrong, had not said he should come home, had not said this was unacceptable behavior from her son. She had said it must be hard for Clara. Passive construction. Dean located somewhere outside the sentence entirely, uninvolved with his own choices. It's been difficult, Clara said, neutral, measured. Of course. A curated pause. I wonder, though, and I know this is a sensitive time, whether perhaps some counseling might help before anything is decided legally. I know a wonderful therapist who works with couples in Beverly. Clara interrupted quietly. Did you know? Silence. Not surprised silence. Not offended silence. The silence of someone who had prepared for this specific question and had practiced not answering it. Know what, darling? Clara waited. Let the silence do its work. She had learned in 6 years of litigation that silence is a tool, that people fill silence to make themselves comfortable, and that what they fill it with tells you everything. About Simone, Clara said finally. About the apartment, about how long this has been happening. Darling, I really think this is between you and Dean. Beverly, yes or no? Another silence, longer this time, and in that silence, Clara heard the answer as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. I was aware, Beverly said finally, that Dean was going through a difficult period. There it was, wrapped in euphemism, dressed in lavender. I was aware. I was aware meant I knew. I knew, and I said nothing. I sat across from you at Christmas dinner, and I passed you the sweet potato casserole, and I asked about your prenatal appointments, and I smiled at your growing belly, and I knew I attended your baby shower. I bought you a rocking chair. I put my hand on your stomach and said, she's going to be so lucky to have you as a mother. And I knew. How long? Clara asked. I don't think, Beverly, her voice was very quiet, almost gentle. I'm going to find out everything regardless. The only thing you control right now is whether you tell me honestly or whether I find out another way. And those two outcomes have very different implications. A long exhale from the other end. About 1.5 years, Beverly said. Clara closed her eyes. 1 beat, 2, 3. 1.5 years? Beverly had known for 1.5 years. Clara had been introduced to Simone's Instagram by a Pavlovian click of paranoia she had immediately apologized to herself for. Beverly had known the name and the face and the existence of this woman for 18 months and had sat across from Clara at every family dinner and said nothing. She had managed Clara's ignorance like a project. Does Gerald know? Clara asked. Gerald suspected. Beverly's voice was careful, choosing each word like footing on uncertain ground. I managed that. Managed it, like a quarterly report, like a public relations crisis. She had actively maintained Dean's secret from his own father. She had been, in her quiet, lavender-scented way, the curator of a fiction that had swallowed an entire family. You should know, Beverly said, her voice shifting, harder now, the velvet wearing thin, that Dean has put a great deal into this family, into that company, into that house you're living in. If things become contentious, it won't be good for anyone. And there it was, the other thing, beneath the sympathy and the concern for counseling and the careful management of information. The actual point of the call. Don't make this worse for us. Clara looked at her phone. She pressed record. Beverly, she said, are you suggesting that I not pursue my legal rights? Of course not. I'm simply... Because I want to understand what you're saying very clearly. Beverly must have sensed the shift in the air. Some animal instinct that recognized when a conversation had changed nature. Her voice went smooth again. Sweet. The velvet back in place. I only want what's best for everyone, she said, including that little girl. So do I, Clara said. We're in complete agreement. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the recording. Then she opened a text to Meg and wrote, I have a recording you need to hear. Meg's response came back in under a minute. Send it now. Clara sent it. She stood up, walked to the kitchen window, looked out at the backyard. They had talked about planting a garden out there. After the baby, after things settled, she had a whole vision for it. Sunflowers along the back fence, herbs by the door, and a small patch of... She almost laughed. Lavender. She'd been planning to plant lavender. Not anymore, sunflowers. She would plant sunflowers. She pressed both hands against the cool glass of the window and looked at the yard and thought, I am not who they think I am. Not anymore. Maybe not for a long time. Maybe I just forgot. Her phone buzzed. Meg. Oh, she's helpful, the text read, in all the ways she doesn't intend to be. Clara put the phone in her pocket. Gerald called 2 days later. Not a strategist or a coordinator, just a 67-year-old man who sounded tired and genuinely ashamed. Clara, he said, I want you to know that I wouldn't have said... He stopped. Started again, the way old men do when they are trying to say something true and finding the words inadequate. What my son is doing is wrong. What Beverly did, keeping both of us in the dark, is wrong. I'm sorry. Clara felt something loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A small valve releasing pressure. Gerald, she said, you can be sorry, but I need you to be useful. Tell me how. There may be business records I need access to, company financials, structure of the partnership. If I need someone to confirm what I believe about how the money has been moving. Without hesitation, Gerald said. Whatever you need. She thanked him and ended the call. Then she went to the bathroom and ran a full tub. The water was hot. She climbed in, fully clothed, maternity leggings, the gray sweater, socks. She didn't care. She sat in the warm water and let it soak through the fabric and felt the heat move through her body, layer by layer. The baby shifted, a comfortable, drowsy movement. Clara leaned her head back against the cool tile. The water smelled like nothing. Just water, clean and neutral and free of lavender. She sat there until the water went cold. Then she got out, wrung out her leggings over the tub, changed into dry clothes, made tea. She carried the tea to the dining room table. She opened her laptop. She took out the yellow legal pad she'd bought at the drugstore 2 days ago. She wrote at the top, What I know, she began. 1 hour later, she had filled 3 pages. Names, dates, amounts where she knew them, gaps where she didn't, connections she could see, and ones she suspected, the architecture of a deception that had been under construction long enough to have load-bearing walls. She looked at what she'd written, then she added at the bottom, in different handwriting, slower and more deliberate, What I am going to find out. She underlined it twice. She started a new page. Trish Halden had been Claire's best friend for 11 years. They had met in law school. Second-year contracts. Trish had leaned over during a particularly dense discussion of consideration doctrine and whispered, if Carlyle versus Carbolic Smokeball Company is on this exam, I will spontaneously combust. Clara had swallowed a laugh so hard she'd coughed, and the professor had looked up, and Trish had looked completely innocent, and that had been that. They had been friends through bar exams and bad apartments, through the death of Clara's father and Trish's father in the same awful winter, 3 years apart. Through 3 terrible relationships, each before Clara met Dean, and Trish married a good man named Pete, and eventually stopped practicing law to run a bakery that made Clara feel both genuinely proud and quietly jealous every time she walked in. When Dean left, Trish was the first person Clara called. "I'm coming over," Trish had said instantly. No questions asked, just coming. And she had. She had arrived with soup, 3 kinds, made herself, and had sat on the kitchen floor with Clara and said, "He is a world-class idiot, and you are going to be absolutely fine." And Clara had believed her because she had needed to. For 3 weeks, Trish was perfect. She brought food, she drove Clara to appointments, she sat in the evenings and watched television and made the empty house feel less like an abandoned place. It was during the 4th week that Clara began to notice the pauses. Nothing dramatic, just small hesitations before certain answers. The particular quality of silence that happens when someone is carefully choosing what to say instead of simply saying it. Like when Clara mentioned the forged documents and Trish said, "Oh, wow." But her eyes went somewhere else for just a second. Like when Clara mentioned Beverly's phone call and Trish said, "What did she say?" Instead of "God, Beverly, I've always found her exhausting." Like when Clara said Owen Burke's name, Dean's business partner, and Trish set down her tea very carefully and looked at the table and said nothing. Clara cataloged each one, the way she cataloged everything now, precise and quiet and without announcement. On a Wednesday evening, 37 weeks into her pregnancy, 4 weeks since Dean had sat in the driveway and ended her assumptions about her life, she asked. They were at the kitchen table. Trish had brought scones. They had been talking about nothing for 20 minutes in the careful way of 2 people circling the real conversation. Clara set down her mug and looked at her oldest friend and said, "What do you know, Trish?" Trish looked up, and Clara saw it immediately. The flinch, the quick calculation behind the eyes, the particular expression of a good person who has carried a secret too long and both hates it and doesn't know how to put it down without making everything worse. "Clara, don't tell me nothing," Clara said. "Don't do that to us." A long silence. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car passed slowly. "I saw them," Trish said. "Once, about 9 months ago, at a restaurant, not your neighborhood, across town. I was meeting Pete for dinner, and they were at a table near the back. I saw Dean first, and then I saw her." A pause. It was obvious what it was. Clara felt the breath leave her slowly, deliberately, like she was choosing to let it go rather than having it taken. "And you didn't tell me," she said. "I didn't know how." Trish's voice broke on the last word. "Clara, you had just told me you were pregnant. You were so happy. You were the happiest I'd seen you in years, and I thought, maybe it was ending on its own. Maybe it was just a thing that would burn out, and telling you would destroy something that could still be saved." "You thought," Clara said carefully, "that keeping me blind was protecting me. I know it wasn't right." "You thought," Clara continued, her voice very quiet, "that I was better off not knowing, while I was pregnant, while he was setting up an apartment, while he was building a second life with documents that had my forged signature on them. Clara, I 9 months, Trish." Clara set her mug down. "That's the entire pregnancy." The words fell into the space between them and stayed there. Trish pressed her hands over her face. Her shoulders shook. Clara watched her. She tried to feel rage. She looked for it the way you look for keys when you're already running late. She checked every drawer. She came up empty. What she found instead was something flatter, heavier, a kind of disappointment that was worse than rage. Because it didn't move, it didn't burn, it just sat in the room and breathed. I have no one left, she thought. Not in the way I thought. She let that be true for a moment, sat with it, let it settle. Then she thought, fine, then I do this without a net. I need you to write it down, Clara said. What you saw, where, when, as much detail as you remember, in an email to Meg Folsom. Trish looked up, red-eyed. Your lawyer? Yes. Can you do that? Of course, yes. Anything, Clara. Don't apologize again right now, Clara said. I can't hear it right now. Write the email. Send it tonight. She walked Trish to the door, closed it, stood with her hand on the wood for a moment. Then she did what she always did when something broke in a way she couldn't immediately fix. She cleaned. Not the whole house, just the kitchen drawers, all 4 of them. She pulled everything out and sorted it into piles on the counter. Things to keep, things to donate, things that should have been thrown away 2 years ago. She found takeout menus from restaurants that had closed, a pin that had dried up completely, a coupon for a baby supply store she'd never visited, expired by 7 months, a small notepad with Dean's handwriting on the first page, a grocery list from years ago, eggs, orange juice, the good coffee. She threw it away. At 11 o'clock, she sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by organized piles. The baby kicked. Strong, purposeful, right to the ribs. Clara pressed her hand against her side where the foot had been. I know, she said. I know. She looked at the clean, organized drawers. Small, insufficient, real. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, typed, call Meg tomorrow. Owen Burke. Company finances. What does Dean's business partner actually know? She pressed save. She sat on the floor for 1 more minute. Then she got up, turned off the kitchen light, went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about 9 months. She thought about all the Tuesday dinners and Saturday mornings and ordinary, unremarkable days she had spent inside a story whose ending had already been written without her. Everyone had decided what Clara could handle. Everyone had been managing her. She was done being managed. Owen Burke had the face of a man who wanted to do the right thing and had been finding reasons to postpone it for 6 months. Clara recognized the type immediately. She had deposed enough of them in her previous life. Decent men with inconvenient loyalties. Men who would prevaricate and deflect until someone made the cost of silence greater than the cost of truth. She didn't call him. She showed up. She drove to the Whitfield Burke Development offices on a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, parked in Visitor, walked through the glass lobby in her good coat. The camel one she'd bought the year before she got pregnant, which still buttoned across her 40-week belly if she left the bottom 2 undone. She told the receptionist she was there to see Owen Burke. She sat down in the waiting area with her hands folded on top of her stomach, and the particular patience of a woman with nothing left to lose and a very clear agenda. Owen came out in 4 minutes. He was a big man, late 40s, the kind of solid that comes from years of construction sites, before years of conference rooms. He looked at Clara standing in his lobby and went very slightly gray around the jaw. Clara, he said. Owen, she smiled pleasantly. Can we talk? He took her to his office. Not Dean's office. Dean hadn't come in for 2 weeks, Owen mentioned, which Clara filed away without comment. He closed the door, sat across from her. His hands rested on the desk. She looked at him for a moment. Let the silence settle. Then she said, What has Dean been doing with the company accounts? Owen's hands went still. There it was, the flinch, the calculation, everything she needed to know in a single, involuntary, physical response. Clara, I'm not really in a position to... Owen, she leaned forward slightly. I practiced law for 6 years. I know what a forensic accountant finds when given proper access during discovery. I know what happens to business partners who are later found to have had knowledge of financial misconduct. I know exactly what I am entitled to under Illinois marital property law. She paused. I am not here to threaten you. I am here because you are a decent man who is about to make a very expensive mistake by staying quiet. Owen looked at the ceiling, then at his hands, then at her. He's been diverting company revenues, Owen said. Off-book accounts has been for about 2 years. 2 years. Clara felt her stomach drop. Not dramatically, just the clean, cold landing of information that confirms what you suspected and is somehow still a shock. How much? She asked. I don't know the full scope. I had suspicions. He pressed his mouth flat. I looked the other way. I'm not proud of that. The apartment he maintained, Clara said. The lifestyle. The second life he was running. It was funded at least in part through company revenues. At least in part, Owen confirmed. Which means marital funds, Clara said. Which means half of it belongs to me. Owen nodded. I can give you the name of the accountant we use, he said. She has access to everything. I believe she's uncomfortable with what she's been asked to document. Clara thanked him. She stood. She was halfway to the door when Owen said, Clara, he came to me last week, asked me to restructure the ownership on paper, a temporary transfer, some assets into my name. She stopped. I said no, Owen said. I want that on the record. Good, Clara said. Make sure it stays on the record, in writing, to your own attorney. She left. She sat in the parking lot. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. She had done this since law school, when a case became large enough to require a cold mind. 1 to 10. Clear the emotion. Find the architecture. 2 years of diverted revenues. A fraudulent transfer attempt. Forged separation documents. An apartment rented 3 months before he left. A mother-in-law who had known for 18 months and made phone calls designed to discourage legal action. This was not a man who had fallen out of love. This was a man who had been preparing, systematically, carefully, across multiple years and multiple relationships and multiple lies calibrated to specific audiences. She had been the audience who received the version where everything was fine. She counted to 10, then she picked up her phone and called Meg. I've just come from Owen Burke's office, she said when Meg answered. He's confirmed 2 years of diverted company revenues. He also confirmed a fraudulent transfer attempt that he refused. A brief silence from Meg. Then, he told you this voluntarily? With gentle encouragement. Clara? Meg's voice had something in it Clara hadn't heard before. Something between satisfaction and respect. You're very good at this. I used to do it professionally, Clara said. You're about to do it professionally again, Meg said. Come in tomorrow. We need to talk about the full picture. Clara said she would. She hung it up. She sat in the parking lot for a little longer. She looked at the building, Whitfield Burke Development. The name in clean letters on the glass. Dean's name first, his company, his empire, such as it was. Built over 10 years, funded, for the last 2 of those years, partly with money that was also hers. She thought about something else then. Not Dean. Something older, a memory she hadn't visited in years. She had been 28, second year at the firm. She'd been seeing a man named Paul before Dean. Older, confident in that specific way that can look like wisdom until it reveals itself as control. He had a habit of making her feel like she was always slightly behind on information everyone else had already processed. Like she should be grateful for his patience with her conclusions. She had left him after 8 months when a colleague had said, carefully and privately, Clara, I'm worried about you. She had spent 2 years after Paul not quite trusting her own instincts, defaulting to caution, playing small, second-guessing the thing she noticed before she'd even finished noticing it. It was how she'd ended up as a stay-at-home wife, she realized now. Not because Dean had asked her to stop working. Not exactly. He had suggested it warmly, reasonably, practically, and some part of her, the part Paul had softened, had accepted the suggestion with relief, because it was easier to be needed than to be capable, easier to be the one who was taken care of than to keep proving she was worth taking care of. She had made herself smaller over 4 years, degree by quiet degree, and then been surprised to find she'd nearly disappeared. She sat outside her old office building. She'd driven there without entirely meaning to, and looked at the glass and steel of 20 floors she had once moved through with absolute certainty. She had won a case in that building that had made the Tribune. She had stood at a podium in a room on the 14th floor and said things she believed and made other people believe them too. She had been very good. She had forgotten that completely. No, that wasn't right. She had been trained out of it, taught to distrust the thing that made her good, taught to call her instincts overreaction, taught to call her observations paranoia. And when a man who did that kind of teaching found her, already half-trained, she had been easy to manage. She was not stupid. She had been worked on. The distinction mattered. She picked up the phone and called Meg again. "I need to tell you something else," Clara said, "about why I didn't see it coming, about a pattern that started before Dean." "Tell me," Meg said. "It matters for the case," Clara said. "It matters for understanding what he did and how he was able to do it." "Tell me everything," Meg said. Clara took a breath, and she talked. Margaret Folsom had been practicing family law for 24 years. She had a taxonomy of difficult men organized in her mind like a field guide to a particularly destructive species: the romantic abandoner, the financial controller, the systematic deceiver, the document forger. In her 24 years, she had encountered men who qualified for one of these categories, sometimes two. Dean Whitfield qualified for all four simultaneously. He overextended himself, she told Clara over coffee, in her office on a Friday morning, 3 days after the Owen meeting. He was managing so many narratives that he stopped watching what was being built on the other side. That is the specific vulnerability of men who lie to everyone. They eventually lose track of what each person knows. Clara was sitting across from Meg's desk. The office was a particular kind of beautiful, functional, and serious, with one wall of windows looking out over the city. Like the office of a person who understood that their work was real and wanted the setting to match. "What do we have?" Clara asked. Meg set down her coffee cup. She opened a folder. "We have the forged documents," she said, "which Simone has now formalized in a signed, sworn statement. We have Owen's testimony about the diverted company accounts, which the forensic accountant has begun tracing, and the preliminary numbers are significantly higher than what Owen estimated. We have Beverly's recorded conversation, which includes language that a reasonable person could interpret as an attempt to discourage legal action." She paused. "We have the refused, fraudulent transfer, documented in writing by Owen to his own attorney. And we have 4 years of your foregone professional income calculated at your billing rate when you left the firm." Clara looked at the folder. 4 years, she said, "at your billing rate." Meg looked at her steadily. "It's a substantial number." Clara absorbed this. "He's going to claim the company isn't worth what it is," she said. "He's going to try," Meg said pleasantly. "And we are going to introduce him to what an independent valuation looks like when the valuation firm has access to the accounts he believed were invisible." Clara nodded. She thought about Dean calling the baby a mistake. a word he had used with Simone to make an inconvenient truth sound like an agreed-upon fact. The baby is a mistake. The marriage is over. Everything is amicable. Just sign here. Except there was no here to sign, because the papers were invented. He thought I'd be too devastated to pay attention, Clara said. Yes, Meg said. Classic miscalculation. He confused emotional pain with incapacity. They're not the same thing, especially not with someone who spent 6 years doing exactly what you used to do. Dean called that afternoon. Claire was painting the nursery accent wall, pale yellow, her mother's suggestion. She had bought the paint 3 weeks before Dean left, and had finally opened the can that morning because the baby was coming regardless, and the wall needed to be yellow. She had paint on her left forearm when her phone rang. Dean. She set down the brush, picked up the phone, looked at his name on the screen. She answered, Clara. His voice was careful, not its old confident warmth, something cooler, like a man testing the temperature of a surface before setting his weight on it. I think we should talk before this gets further out of hand. It's in hand, Clara said. Just not yours. A pause. What does that mean? It means I have excellent representation and I've been very productive. This conversation should happen through our attorneys. Clara. And here came the shift, the slight loosening of the careful voice, the note underneath. I'm worried about you, about the stress. This level of conflict can't be good for the baby. She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together and kept it inside. He was invoking the baby he had left, the baby he had described to another woman as a mistake. Now suddenly the baby was his concern. Now the baby was the reason Clara should slow down and reconsider, and perhaps not pursue the legal rights that were hers by law and by fact. The baby is fine, Clara said. She's strong, like her mother. I made a mistake, Dean said. His voice had that quality now, the warmth coming back, carefully, like a man turning up a dimmer. A serious one. I know that. Simone and I are finished. I've been doing a lot of thinking about what I really want, about what matters, about us. Dean. He stopped. No, Clara said. Simply, clearly, without heat or drama, without the trembling she might have expected from herself 1 month ago. Just the word, placed down like a verdict that had already been read into the record. You haven't even heard what I have heard everything I need to hear. You forged documents. You defrauded me of marital assets. You let your mother call me and suggest I not exercise my legal rights. You left a 32-week pregnant woman sitting in a car window and drove away. She paused. No. Whatever you're about to say, no. A long silence. When he spoke again, the warmth was entirely gone. What was underneath it was what she'd always suspected was underneath it, and had talked herself out of suspecting. You should think very carefully about what you're doing, he said. I have thought carefully, Clara said, for approximately 5 weeks straight. Thank you for calling. She hung up. She looked at her phone. She picked up her paintbrush. She kept painting. The wall became yellow, pale and clean and new, the color of something beginning. That was the week Dean tried 3 things. He called Beverly, who called Clara. Voicemail, forwarded to Meg. He called Owen and applied significant pressure. Owen sent a written account to his own attorney and copied Meg. He hired a new legal firm downtown, aggressive, expensive, known for complex litigation, and sent a letter suggesting the company valuation was a fraction of its actual worth. Meg sent back a response that caused the opposing attorney to call Meg directly and have a long and apparently instructive conversation. What did he say? Clara asked. That his client is poorly positioned, Meg said. I told him that was a generous assessment. On a Friday evening 3 weeks before her due date, Clara's mother arrived. Nora Calloway came with 2 suitcases, a casserole, and the absolute composure of a 61-year-old woman who had buried a husband and raised 2 daughters and survived enough life to know the difference between things that break you and things that rebuild you as something harder. She walked in. She looked around the house. She walked to the nursery and stood in the doorway and looked at the pale yellow wall, the assembled crib, the small stacked onesies in the dresser. "You did all this yourself?" she said. "Most of it," Clara said. Nora touched the crib rail, left her hand there for a moment. "You've always been better in a crisis than you know," she said. "I should have seen it sooner," Clara said. "No," Nora turned. Her voice was clear and direct the way only a mother's can be. "You should have been treated better. That is not the same thing as not noticing. You noticed plenty. You were told not to trust what you noticed. That's what he did. That's what men who operate the way he operates do." Clara looked at her mother. "Tell me I'm going to be okay," she said. "You're going to be okay," Nora said. "And then you're going to be more than okay. And then I don't have a word for what comes after that, but it's something I'm going to brag about." Clara laughed. It came out wet at the edges. Real. She wiped her eyes with the back of her paint-stained hand. "Dinner is in the oven," Nora said. "You have 40 minutes to rest before you're required to eat." Clara lay down on the couch. Nora moved quietly in the kitchen. The smell of the casserole began to fill the house, onions and garlic, and something warm and familiar. The smell of her childhood kitchen, the smell of being taken care of. Clara closed her eyes. She thought, "I am 38 weeks pregnant, and my mother is in my kitchen, and the pale yellow wall in the nursery is dry and ready, and my lawyer has a folder full of things that are going to matter." She thought, "That is enough for tonight." She slept. Her water broke on a Wednesday morning at 6:47. Her mother was already awake. Nora was in the kitchen making coffee when Clara appeared in the doorway and said, with remarkable calm, "I think it's time." Nora set down the coffee, picked up her keys, said coat, and pointed at the hook by the door. Clara got her coat. They drove in the dark of early morning. October had turned to November, while Clara hadn't been watching. The trees were bare now. The streets were quiet. Clara sat in the passenger seat with her hospital bag on her lap and the sensation of being inside a story much larger than herself. She had thought about whether to call Dean. She had thought about it 3 times over the last 2 weeks and come to the same answer each time. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. He had made choices. Choices had consequences. Consequences did not pause for sentiment. She called Trish instead. Old habit. The instinct of 11 years. She held the phone and felt the weight of 4 weeks of complicated silence between them and the longer weight of a decade of genuine friendship, and she made a decision. She called. "I'm going to the hospital," she said when Trish picked up, groggy and then instantly alert. Trish arrived 20 minutes after they did. She came through the hospital doors red-eyed and slightly breathless, carrying a bakery bag she had clearly grabbed on impulse from the display case at her own shop. "Croissants?" Clara said. "I panicked," Trish said. And then, quietly, looking at Clara with 11 years of friendship and 4 weeks of guilt and something that was trying very hard to be brave. "I'm so sorry, Clara." Clara looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said. "We'll work it out. Later. Right now, just stay." Trish stayed. Nora stayed. The day moved the way Labor Days move. Long and then suddenly fast. Exhausting and then briefly euphoric and then exhausting again. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic, and the flowers Nora had insisted on stopping for on the way. A small bunch of sunflowers, yellow and stubborn, sitting on the windowsill. 17 hours after her water broke, Cassidy Nora Whitfield arrived. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, loud as a siren, absolute and determined from the first second of her existence. Clara held her daughter. She looked at this small, complete, furious, miraculous person. This person who had been present through all of it. Through the car window and the kitchen floor and the legal pads and the bath in her clothes and the midnight drawer, cleaning, and the pale yellow wall. Who had been there through every single moment of the last 5 weeks, rolling and kicking and entirely unimpressed by the difficulties of the world outside. Everything else receded to its proper proportion. Not the betrayal, not the anger, not the folder on Meg's desk, not the hearing that was coming, not Dean, wherever he was on this Wednesday morning in November, just this face, this grip around one of Clara's fingers, this. And then, right then, looking at her daughter's face, something fell. She felt it go. Physically. A weight leaving her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Not Dean's mask, her own. She saw it clearly for the first time. The woman she had been performing, the excellent wife, the gracious daughter-in-law. The woman who folded his shirts and swallowed her instincts and called it contentment. The woman who had made herself smaller and quieter and more agreeable and told herself it was wisdom when actually it was fear. She had been very, very good at the performance. It had not made her happy. It had made her feel safe, she had believed. And then it had failed at the one thing she'd accepted it for. She looked at her daughter. I will not teach you, she thought, that kind of safety. I will not show you a woman performing smallness and call it love. I will show you a woman who knows what she's worth and charges accordingly. Nora's hand pressed her shoulder, warm and steady and entirely certain. There she is, Nora whispered. Both of them. There they both are. Cassidy opened her eyes, dark and unfocused and ancient with the particular gravity of the newly arrived. She stared at Clara with complete attention. Clara smiled. Hi, she said. I'm your mom. I'm a work in progress, but I promise you, I'm going to be great. Trish made a sound from the corner that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Nora said nothing, just kept her hand on Clara's shoulder. The sunflowers on the windowsill were yellow against the gray November light. Clara held her daughter and felt the mask settle somewhere on the floor and did not pick it back up. Cassidy was 6 weeks old when the hearing date arrived. Clara wore the black blazer she had worn to her last jury trial at the firm. It fit differently now, not badly, differently, like wearing something you've grown into rather than something you're trying to live up to. She fed Cassidy at 5:30 in the morning while Nora made coffee. The baby nursed with the focused efficiency that Clara had come to think of as her daughter's fundamental personality trait. Cassidy approached everything with complete seriousness and no time for distractions. She's very businesslike, Nora had observed the week before. She gets it from me, Claire had said. At 7, she kissed Cassidy's forehead and handed her to her mother and walked out to the car. Meg was already in the courthouse lobby when Clara arrived. Standing straight in a charcoal suit, a leather folder under her arm, looking entirely unbothered by the occasion. The look of a woman who had been in this building many times and found it unremarkable. Ready? Meg asked. Yes, Clara said. They walked in. The hearing room was smaller than Clara had expected. Beige walls, institutional lighting, a judge's bench that was imposing by convention rather than by actual grandeur. Clara took her seat on one side of the central table. Dean sat on the other side. She had not seen him since the car window. 47 days. He looked different. Not badly. Not in the way she had perhaps expected. No obvious dissolution, no visible consequences written on his face. He was well-dressed. His jaw was set. But something around his eyes, a slight hollowness, the particular look of a man who has believed his own story for so long that being required to abandon it has cost him something he can't name. Clara looked at him steadily for a moment. She felt less than she had expected. She had braced for grief or rage or both, pressing up against the professional calm she was trying to maintain. What she found instead was something quieter, the feeling of a woman who had done her preparation and was here to collect what was owed. Meg was extraordinary. She spoke for 40 minutes and made it look effortless. The particular skill of a person who has done this so many times that what looks like grace is actually 24 years of accumulated precision. She presented the forensic accountant's findings first. 2 years of diverted company revenues. The total was significantly higher than even Owen's estimate. She named the accounts. She showed the trail. She let the numbers speak with the particular authority that numbers have when they have been verified and documented and signed by 3 independent professionals. She presented the forged separation agreement alongside Simone's sworn statement. She was careful here. Specific about what the document contained, specific about what Simone had been told, specific about the notary number that did not exist in any state registry. She presented Beverly's recorded phone call. She presented Owen Burke's 12-page notarized testimony, which she noted Owen had prepared with evident thoroughness. She presented the refused fraudulent asset transfer and the documentation Owen had filed with his own attorney, confirming he had declined and documented his declination. She presented Clara's employment history, her billing rate at the firm, 6 years of legal practice, 4 years of foregone income, the professional contribution that had never appeared on a tax return but had, in every material way, subsidized the life and the company that Dean now claimed as entirely his. Dean's attorney objected several times. Each objection was addressed by Meg with the particular quiet of a woman who had anticipated every one of them before breakfast. The judge, a woman in her late 50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, with the expression of someone who has heard many things and is no longer capable of being surprised by human behavior. Read through the documents, made notes, asked 2 questions, both of which Meg answered without consulting the folder. Then the judge looked at Dean, then at Clara. She did not say much. She didn't need to. When the preliminary ruling came down, substantially in Clara's favor, on all primary points, with a full independent accounting ordered, the fraudulent transfer attempt flagged for further review, and a spousal support calculation that reflected 4 years of foregone professional income. Dean went very still. His attorney put a hand briefly on his arm. Dean didn't move. Clara watched him absorb it, watched the jaw set, and then, slowly release, watched him understand, perhaps for the first time, what he had actually been dealing with. She thought about the car window, the flat voice, the one word, yes. She thought about sitting on the kitchen floor, staring at folded shirts. She thought about 3 pages of legal notes, written at midnight on a yellow pad. She looked at him now and thought, I don't hate you. I don't even feel very much. I feel done, the way you feel when a case is finished and correctly decided, and you can put the folder in the archive and move on. She leaned slightly toward Meg. How did he think he'd get away with it? She said quietly. He thought, Meg said, equally quiet, that you'd be too devastated to be dangerous. Clara almost smiled. Dean caught her eye across the room. Something moved across his face, recognition, the specific look of a person finally seeing something they have been looking at incorrectly for a long time. Clara held his gaze for one moment. Then she looked away. She was done looking at him. Outside the courthouse, Meg put her arm briefly around Clara's shoulders, uncharacteristic, and therefore meaningful. Good work, Meg said. You did the work, Clara said. You gave me everything to work with. That's the harder part. The autumn light was cold and clean on the courthouse steps. Clara stood in it for a moment, tilted her face up, let it fall across her closed eyes. Then she took out her phone and called her mother. "It went well," she said when Nora answered. "I know," her mother said immediately. "You don't know the result." "I know you," Nora said. Same thing. Cassidy made a small sound in the background, a complaint. The sound of a 6-week-old who has been patient long enough and has decided patience is overrated. Clara smiled at the courthouse steps. "I'll be home in an hour," she said. "We'll be here," Nora said. Clara called Simone 3 months after the hearing. She had thought about it for a while. She had reached various conclusions and then reconsidered them. She had decided not to call and then changed her mind. She had thought about what kind of woman she was building herself into and what that woman would do. She called. She took Cassidy out in the stroller first. February now, cold and clear, the sky a particular winter blue that felt newly washed. She walked the neighborhood for 40 minutes with the baby bundled into a snowsuit that made her look like a small, very serious astronaut. Then she sat on a bench near the park and took out her phone. Simone answered on the second ring. "Clara?" Careful. Like someone testing whether a bridge will hold. "I wanted to let you know how things went," Clara said. "The hearing was in December. The ruling was in my favor on all significant points. The forensic accounting is ongoing." A quiet exhale. "I'm glad. Your statement helped, significantly. I wanted you to know that." "I wasn't sure it would matter." "It did," Clara said. "The forged documents were central to establishing intent. Your sworn statement made them undeniable." A pause. Then, "How are you?" And the bus. "Cassidy," Clara said. "She's 3 months old. She's very serious and very loud, and she has an opinion about everything already." A small sound from the other end. Something that might have been a laugh. Genuine. Surprised. "That's a wonderful name," Simone said. "I thought so," Clara said. They were quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of two people who have no obvious language for what they are to each other. "How are you?" Clara asked. "I moved," Simone said. "Back to Philadelphia. I'm working. Headshots, small campaigns, nothing big. I'm..." A breath. "I'm clearer. About a lot of things." "Good," Clara said. "I keep thinking about it," Simone said carefully. "About the kind of person who does what he did, who builds that, who looks at the two different women and decides the answer to every complication is more lying. He's the kind of person," Clara said, "who has always been believed, because he's charming and certain and has people around him who find the fiction convenient until they don't." "You sound like a lawyer," Simone said. "I am a lawyer," Clara said. "As of last month, officially. I've joined Meg Folsom's practice, 3 days a week to start." A surprised silence, then something warm in it. "Good," Simone said. "Really, really good, Clara." "Take care of yourself," Clara said. "You too." She hung up. She sat on the bench. Cassidy slept in the stroller, her face tilted sideways, entirely unconcerned with the world's complications. Clara thought about the word enemy. How she had expected to have one. How she had built armor against a specific person and arrived at the fight to find no one standing on that particular spot. How the woman she'd been ready to hate had turned out to be another person, handed a script full of lies and told it was the truth. The actual villain had been the man in the car, the man with the set jaw and the calculated warmth and the parallel lives maintained across 4 years with the careful, exhausting precision of someone who believed he was smarter than the consequences of his choices. He was in the process of discovering otherwise, and the two women he had lied to were both in different cities, different contexts, moving in different directions, fine. Clara found that satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just the right ordering of things, finally. The correct resolution of an incorrect equation. She bent forward and tucked the blanket more firmly around Cassidy's small shoulders. The baby didn't wake. She made the small sound she made when she was deeply comfortable. Content with the situation, Clara straightened. She pushed the stroller back along the path toward home. The trees were bare, and the sky was that specific winter blue, and her coat was warm, and her daughter was sleeping, and somewhere across town, a forensic accountant was finding things in spreadsheets that Dean had believed were invisible. She thought, the hardest part was admitting I knew all along, that I saw the signs and called them paranoia, that I received a warning in a deleted Instagram comment and filed it under probably nothing. She thought, I will never file things under probably nothing again. She thought, I know exactly what I am. I know exactly what I am worth it. And I will never again perform smallness for the comfort of someone else. The realization did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived the way most true things arrive, quietly, after much work, almost unremarkable, because it had been coming for so long. She was not who she had been in the car window. She was not the woman who had folded shirts and called it enough. She did not miss either of them. She walked home through the cold blue February day with her daughter sleeping in the stroller and felt something she did not immediately have a word for, something warmer than relief, something more lasting than victory, something like herself. It was a Tuesday when Claire went back. Not a special Tuesday, just one. Cold and ordinary and entirely hers. The kind that arrived without announcement and belonged to no one but the people who showed up to use it. She dressed carefully that morning, not ceremonially, carefully. The black blazer again, because it was good and it was hers, and she liked the way she looked in it. Dark trousers. Boots with a heel that was practical rather than decorative. The silver earrings her mother had given her the Christmas before last, because Nora had said they looked like a woman who made decisions, and Clara had been storing that description in a place she could find it when she needed it. She fed Cassidy at 5:45. The baby ate with her usual focused efficiency, completely absorbed, completely present, already at 3 months, fundamentally herself. You're going to be something, Clara told her. Cassidy looked up with dark, certain eyes and seemed to agree. Nora took the baby at 7:15. She was staying, had been staying since October, and had stopped pretending she was going back to her own apartment in the spring. She had reorganized Clara's kitchen entirely, which Clara had decided to accept as an act of love. Go, Nora said, holding Cassidy against her shoulder. We'll walk later. Clara kissed her daughter's head, let herself breathe in the particular smell of her for a moment. Then she went to the car. The drive was 20 minutes, downtown. The building where Folsom Family Law occupied part of the 14th floor of a steel and glass tower that Clara had been inside 300 times as a client and was about to be inside for the first time as something else. The reception area had a framed print on the wall that Meg had put there the week Clara joined. One sentence, plain letters, no decoration. The most important moment is now. Clara had thought it was slightly much when she first read it. She had since revised that opinion entirely. She walked to her office, not Meg's office, her own, a small one at the end of the hallway with a window that looked out over the street and a desk that she had deliberately kept clear except for what she needed. A laptop, a notepad, the good pen her mother had given her, and a small framed photograph of Cassidy taken in the hospital at approximately 40 minutes old, furious and magnificent and entirely undone by the inconvenience of existence. She hung up her coat. She sat down. She thought for a moment about a Tuesday in October, a car idling in a driveway, a phone call from 15 feet away, the cold tile of the kitchen floor under her palms. She thought about 3 pages of notes on a yellow legal pad, about a bath taken fully clothed, about kitchen drawers sorted at midnight and an expired coupon and a dried-up pen and a phone checked 3 times in the dark. Lock, unlock, lock. She thought about Meg's folder, full of documented truths, about Owen's testimony delivered with visible relief, about Beverly's voice on a recording, velvet over iron, saying the wrong thing in exactly the right way, about Simone's voice on the phone, frightened and then brave and then months later, clear. She thought about a hospital room in November and a small person arriving loud and certain and gripping one of Clara's fingers with the absolute conviction of someone who has already decided this person is worth holding on to. She thought about the courthouse steps in December and the autumn light. No, winter light by then. And her mother's voice saying, "I know you." Same thing. The divorce had finalized in January. The settlement was, in Meg's words, appropriately corrective. Dean had retained the company in diminished form after the repayments were ordered from the diverted accounts and the independent valuation set the actual worth. Owen had purchased the additional stake. The firm would probably survive. Dean had moved to a smaller apartment. Clara had kept the house. She had replanted the backyard. She had put sunflowers along the back fence, full flats of them, dormant in February, ready to go mad in the spring. Her mother had helped her press them into the cold ground, both of them on their knees in the November mud, with Cassidy watching from a bouncy seat on the back porch, opinionated about the whole enterprise. No lavender, never lavender. She opened the file on her desk. First case. Her own case now. Co-counsel with Meg. A woman 44 years old. 2 teenagers. A husband who had been moving money quietly for 3 years and believed he had been moving it invisibly. Sound familiar? Meg had said, sliding the folder across. Uncomfortably, Claire had replied. Good, Meg said. That means you'll be exceptional. Clara read through the intake documents, made notes in the margin the way she used to. Small, precise notations in the shorthand she'd developed in law school, and never entirely lost, even in 4 years of not using it. The woman's name was Sandra. She had come in with a grocery bag full of documents she had spent 3 months quietly collecting. Tax returns, bank statements, printouts of online accounts she had figured out how to access through a password she found written in the back of a notebook. She had placed the grocery bag on Meg's desk and said, "I think he's hiding money. I don't know how much." Clara knew what it felt like to be that woman. To be the person standing in the attorney's office with the grocery bag of evidence and the years of not quite trusting what you'd noticed. She knew what it felt like, and she knew what that woman needed, and she knew, precisely and without uncertainty, how to give it to her. She pressed her palm flat on the open file. She heard, down the hallway, Meg's door open and close, the sound of morning beginning, coffee from the small kitchen, a phone ringing at the reception desk. Outside her window, the city was moving. Ordinary Tuesday morning. People walking to ordinary places with their ordinary concerns. The unremarkable machinery of a day that didn't know or care that it was the first of something. Clara looked at the photograph of Cassidy on her desk. 40 minutes old, furious and magnificent. She thought about the word she had found in the novel Nora had left on the kitchen table. Not in a self-help chapter, not in a list of affirmations. Just inside a story, offered quietly, without announcement. Becoming. She had been becoming through all of it. Through the floor, and the bath, and the midnight drawers, and the legal pads, and the parking lots, and the courtrooms, even when it felt like only survival, even when it felt like nothing was happening except endurance. She had been becoming this, a woman at a desk on a Tuesday, with a case file that needed her full attention, and a baby at home with her grandmother, and a yard full of dormant sunflowers waiting for March, and exactly enough scars to make her useful. She was not the woman who had stood at the car window. She was not the woman who had folded the shirts and called it love. She was not the woman who had made herself small enough to fit inside someone else's fiction and called it safety. She was Clara, just Clara, unperformed, unmanaged, entirely herself. The mask had been off for months now. She didn't miss it. She didn't miss it at all. She picked up the good pen her mother had given her. She turned to the first page of her notes. She began.
There is a moment in this story that has nothing to do with lawyers or courtrooms or forged documents. It happens in a hospital room in November after 17 hours of labor. Clara holds her daughter for the first time, and something falls off of her, not dramatically, not with music or a speech, just quietly, like setting down a bag she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it had weight. The mask, the one she had worn for 4 years, the excellent wife, the gracious daughter-in-law, the woman who folded the shirts and swallowed her instincts and called it contentment, the woman who made herself smaller, degree by quiet degree, and told herself that was wisdom. That moment, that quiet falling, is the real heart of this story, not the verdict, not the settlement, not even the phone call to the lawyer on the kitchen floor. The real heart is a woman recognizing, finally, that she had been living inside a performance and choosing, at the most exhausted, most vulnerable, most uncertain moment of her life, to stop. Here is what this story is really about. It is about the difference between not seeing something and being taught not to trust what you see. These are not the same thing, not even close. Clara was not naive. She was not foolish. She was a trained legal mind who had spent years reading situations and people with precision. But she had also been worked on. By Paul first, then by Dean, slowly, carefully, in the particular way that certain people have of making you doubt your own perception until doubting it feels like the reasonable choice. Gaslighting does not always arrive as shouting or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as warmth, as patience, as a gentle suggestion that you might be overreacting, that you might be imagining things, that the person who loves you would surely know better than your own nervous system what is real. And the insidious thing, the thing that makes it so hard to name and so hard to leave, is that it works. Not because the person being gaslit is weak, but because trust is not a character flaw. Believing the person you love is not stupidity. It is the thing love requires. The cruelty is not in the trusting. The cruelty is in the betrayal of it. This story does not ask you to stop trusting. It asks you to remember that your instincts are data, that the thing you noticed and then talked yourself out of noticing, that small cold feeling, that hairline crack, that comment you screenshot at 3 a.m. and then told yourself was nothing, that was information. You were not paranoid. You were paying attention. And here is what else this story carries. The people around Clara, Trish, Beverly, Owen, all made the same mistake in different forms. They decided, each in their own way, that Clara was better off not knowing, that protecting her from the truth was an act of kindness. It was not. Withholding truth from someone, however gently, however lovingly, however carefully reasoned, is still removing their ability to choose. It is deciding for them what they can handle. And that decision, no matter how well-intentioned, is its own kind of betrayal. If you are holding a truth that belongs to someone else, this story is asking you something. Not to be cruel, not to be reckless, but to ask yourself whether your silence is really about protecting them, or whether it is about protecting yourself from the difficulty of the conversation. There is a difference, and the person you're protecting deserves to know which one it is. This story also carries something for the Simones of the world, for the people who found themselves inside a fiction someone else created, who believed what they were shown, because why would someone fabricate an entire reality and hand it over with a steady hand and a certain voice? Who discovered too late that the documents were forged and the story was constructed, and the person they thought they knew was a performance delivered specifically for them. You are not responsible